I always knew that my relationship with my father was far from perfect, but even as a child, I understood that he could have at least pretended to care. My dad, Michael, was cold, silent, and seemed so emotionally distant that I started to think he simply didn't know how to show love. It seemed like he had always been that way, even before my mom, Catherine, passed away, but back then, at least her warmth balanced out his indifference. I was an only child, and after my mom's funeral when I was 12, my world changed forever. At first, my dad tried to hold it together, but his grief quickly turned into something that felt like apathy toward everything, including me. The house I grew up in became cold and empty. He barely spoke to me, and when I tried to ask anything about Mom, he would just clench his jaw and turn away. I learned not to bring her up because I knew the answer would be silence. And then Lori appeared. 9 months after my mom died, my dad brought home a woman I had never seen before. She was a few years younger than him, with well-groomed blonde hair and a heavy, sweet perfume that made me nauseous. She showed up one evening and never left. Lori never tried to be kind. She didn't even pretend to be interested in taking care of me. From the very beginning, it was clear that I was an unwanted part of her new life with my father. She didn't yell at me, didn't hit me. No, it was much worse. She simply acted as if I didn't exist. I would come home from school to find them sitting in the kitchen, laughing, drinking tea. I'd say, hi, but they ignored me. If I left my things in the hallway, they disappeared. If I wanted to talk to my dad, she would answer instead of him. Over time, I learned not to get in their way, not to expect love, not to try to be part of their lives. My dad never defended me. If he saw how she treated me, he never interfered. He just withdrew even more, and I realized I was completely alone. At 16, I got my first job as a waitress at a small diner near my school to have my own money. They wouldn't let me take extra shifts, but even those few dollars gave me a sense of freedom. I knew that once I graduated, I would leave and never look back. By the time I turned 18, I had a plan. I had saved up some money, enrolled in a local college, rented a tiny room with a friend, and left. I didn't expect my dad to stop me, but deep down, I guess I still hoped he would say something. He didn't even come outside to say goodbye. Lori, though, she smiled. A real, genuine smile. For the first time in all those years. Living on my own was hard, but for the first time, I felt free. I studied, worked, sometimes went hungry, but I never went back. A few years later, I met Jason, my future husband. He was kind, caring, nothing like what I had grown up with. He taught me that love wasn't supposed to be silence and indifference. We got married. We had 2 children. For the first time, I was truly happy. And my father? He never called. Never asked if I was alive. I occasionally heard about him from distant relatives. He and Lori were doing well, traveling, buying a new house. They never mentioned me. And then, after 20 years of silence, I got a phone call. It was Lori. Her voice didn't sound as confident as before. She spoke quietly, nervously. Your father needs help, she said. He has cancer. I stayed silent. He wants to see you. I thought I'd feel anger, triumph, something, but I felt nothing. I grew up without his love. I learned to live without him. And now, I had to decide whether I wanted to be a part of his life, now that it was convenient for him. For years, I barely thought about my father. After that phone call from Lori about his cancer, I had expected some feelings to resurface. Anger, pity, maybe even guilt. But there was nothing. I didn't visit, didn't check in, didn't care. He had spent my entire childhood pretending I didn't exist, so I saw no reason to suddenly play the role of the concerned daughter. He had Lori, he had his life, and I had mine. Then, out of nowhere, he reappeared. It started with a single text. Michael, hi Sarah. Hope you're well. Would love to meet up. Let me know when you're free. It was so casual, as if he hadn't ignored me for 2 decades. As if he hadn't let Lori push me out of his life. As if we were long-lost friends catching up. I didn't reply. The messages kept coming. Michael, I heard the kids are growing up fast. Would love to see them. Michael, thinking about you. Let's have dinner soon. Michael, don't ignore me. I'm still your father. That last one made me laugh. Now he wanted to be my father? Now that he was old, probably lonely? Now that he realized I had a family of my own? Where was this concern when I was a scared little girl, desperately wanting a parent to love her? I ignored him for months. Jason was supportive, always reminding me that I didn't owe him anything, but eventually, curiosity got the best of me. We met at a coffee shop. Michael had aged, of course. His hair was almost entirely gray, his face thinner, his once straight posture slightly hunched. But his eyes, the same cold, calculating eyes, hadn't changed. He wasn't there out of love. He was there because he wanted something. I've been thinking about family, he said, stirring his coffee. It's important, you know. At the end of the day, that's all we have. I almost choked on my tea. Now he cared about family? I'd like to see my grandkids, he continued. I think it's time. I didn't argue. I just told him I'd think about it. At first, I was cautious. I let him meet the kids, but only in public, only with me there. Jason didn't like it, but I reassured him that if I saw even a hint of the man I grew up with, I'd cut him off again. The first few visits went well enough. My kids, Emily, 15, Josh, 13, and Noah, 10, were polite but distant, which was expected. They didn't know this man, and I didn't force them to pretend otherwise. But soon, cracks began to show. Michael was unreliable. He'd make plans with the kids, trips to the zoo, lunch dates, movie nights, and then cancel at the last minute. Something came up, he'd say. We'll reschedule. But he never did. Birthdays? He forgot them. Emily turned 16, nothing. Josh made the school soccer team, nothing. Noah won first place in a science fair, nothing. But whenever he wanted attention, he expected us to drop everything. Then came the worst part, the photos. Michael loved pictures. Not real moments, not actual bonding time, just the illusion of being a devoted grandfather. At family events, he'd swoop in, throw his arm around the kids, snap a few pictures, and then disappear. He didn't stay to talk to them, didn't ask about their lives. He just wanted proof. Look at me, he'd say, scrolling through his phone showing his friends. The proud grandpa. One day, I saw him post a picture of Emily on Facebook, a picture she didn't even know he had taken. The caption read, "So proud of my granddaughter. Growing up so fast. Family first." I confronted him. "You don't even know her," I snapped. "You don't know any of them. You can't just show up for a photo and pretend you're part of their lives." His response? "I'm trying, Sarah. You're the one turning them against me." I laughed in disbelief. "They don't need me to turn them against you. You're doing that yourself." Then came the final straw. Michael planned a special weekend with the kids, a cabin trip. My children were hesitant. They had sports, schoolwork, and frankly, they weren't comfortable spending a weekend alone with a man who felt like a stranger. When I told Michael they couldn't make it, he lost it. "This is you, Sarah," he shouted over the phone. "You've poisoned them against me. You're making me the bad guy." "No, Dad," I said, my voice eerily calm. "You did that all on your own." That was the last time I spoke to him. I should have known better than to accept Lori's invitation. The message arrived out of nowhere. Polite, formal, completely insincere. "Lori, hi Sarah. Hope you're doing well. We're hosting a family appreciation dinner this Sunday. It would mean a lot to Michael if you and the kids could attend. Family is so important, and we'd love to celebrate that together." Family? Now they cared about family? I showed the text to Jason. He barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "They just want to put on a show," he said. "You know that, right?" Of course I knew. Michael and Lori had spent years pretending I didn't exist. The sudden shift wasn't about genuine connection. It was about appearances. They wanted an audience. They wanted to prove to their friends and extended relatives that they were good people, loving family members. They wanted a photo op. I almost declined, but then I thought about my kids. Michael had been playing the victim lately, acting like he was being unfairly shut out. And honestly, I was tired of it. If he wanted to play the devoted grandfather in public, fine. Let's see how well that performance held up when faced with the truth. So I replied, "Me will be there." The dinner was held at an upscale restaurant, some overpriced steakhouse with dim lighting and leather booths. Lori, of course, had booked a private dining room. Couldn't have the perfect family image ruined by prying eyes, after all. When we arrived, the room was already packed. Lori and Michael sat at the head of the table, smiling like royalty, while various extended family members, people I hadn't seen in years, greeted us with forced enthusiasm. There were Lori's friends, Michael's old business associates, distant cousins. People who barely knew us but were eager to witness this beautiful reunion. I could tell my kids were uncomfortable. Emily, 15, gave me a look that screamed, "Why are we here?" Josh, 13, was already slouching in his chair, and Noah, 10, sat stiffly, hands in his lap. They weren't stupid. They knew this was fake. Michael stood up and clinked his glass. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he announced, his voice dripping with self-importance. "Family means everything to me, and I'm so grateful to have mine here together, celebrating what truly matters." I nearly choked on my water. Lori beamed at him, then turned to us. "Sarah, Jason, kids, we're so thrilled you could make it." The room filled with polite murmurs of agreement. Everyone was watching us, waiting for the perfect heartwarming moment. Then Michael turned to my kids. "I'm especially grateful to have my wonderful grandkids here." He smiled as if he had any idea who they were. "It's so important to stay close as a family, to make time for each other. I love you all so much." Emily let out a short, bitter laugh. I knew that laugh. It was the sound of someone who had had enough. "Oh really?" she said, her voice sharp. "Because I don't remember the last time you even called." The room fell silent. Michael's smile faltered. "Sweetheart, that's not true." "It is true," Josh cut in. "You say family's important, but you ignore us. You forget our birthdays. You cancel plans. You don't even know anything about us." Noah, usually the quietest, spoke up next. "You only want to see us when it makes you look good." Michael's face turned red. Lori's forced smile tightened. Around the table, guests shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. This wasn't the heartwarming moment they had been expecting. Michael started, but Emily wasn't finished. "You don't get to act like some amazing grandfather when you've never even tried," she said coldly. "You just want pictures so you can pretend to be involved. But you're not. And we're done pretending too." Silence. Heavy. Unbearable. Lori was the first to crack. "Well," she said, letting out a stiff laugh. "Teenagers, huh? So dramatic." She waved a hand as if my children's words meant nothing. "Sarah, you really should teach them to be more respectful." I saw red. Respect. I repeated. "You want respect?" From the kids you've ignored their entire lives. I shook my head, letting out a bitter laugh. You invited us here to put on a show, and now you're upset because the truth isn't the story you wanted to tell. Michael's hands clenched into fists. That's not fair, he snapped. I've tried. No, I cut him off. You haven't. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You're poisoning them against me. Here we go. The victim act. Lori jumped in, voice sharp. This is what you wanted, isn't it, Sarah? To humiliate us? To make us look like bad people? You don't need my help with that, I shot back. You did it all on your own. Michael glared at me, chest rising and falling rapidly. You're still the same ungrateful, selfish girl you always were. Jason, who had been silent this whole time, stood up. Enough, he said, his voice low, firm. We're done here. He turned to the kids. Let's go. Emily was the first to stand, followed by Josh and Noah. None of them even glanced at Michael or Lori as they walked toward the door. As I followed, Michael's voice rang out behind me. You'll regret this, Sarah. I turned to face him one last time. No, Dad. I regret ever giving you another chance. And with that, we walked out, leaving them humiliated in front of everyone they had so desperately tried to impress. Michael never wanted a real relationship with my children. He wanted a reputation, an image of the devoted grandfather, the wise elder, the kind-hearted family man. And when reality didn't match the picture he wanted to present, he did what he had always done, he lied. It started with Facebook. One afternoon, I received a call from my cousin Rachel, who sounded both amused and irritated as she asked if I had seen what my father had just posted. Confused, I told her I hadn't, and she simply told me to check Facebook and call her back. The moment I opened the app, I saw it, a long dramatic post from Michael, dripping with self-pity and manipulation. Family is the most important thing in the world. I've always done my best to be there for my daughter and my grandchildren, but sadly, some people let bitterness and resentment cloud their hearts. I miss my grandkids every day, but when a parent poisons their minds, what can you do? I just hope that one day, they'll know the truth. Family should be about love, not grudges. I will always be here for them when they're ready. I barely had time to process the sheer audacity of his words before I saw the comment section, which was filled with exactly the kind of sympathy he had been fishing for. There were messages from distant relatives, from old acquaintances, even from people I barely knew, all telling him to stay strong, that the children would come around one day, that I was selfish for keeping them from their loving grandfather. It was a disgusting display of manipulation, and I felt a wave of rage that I hadn't felt in years. I could handle him being a terrible father, I had made my peace with that a long time ago, but to publicly paint himself as the victim, to make it seem as though I was cruelly depriving my children of his love when he had never once made a real effort to be in their lives, was something I simply could not ignore. I wasn't the only one furious. Emily, my eldest, had seen it too, and when she came into the room, her hands were shaking with anger as she demanded to know why he was lying. Jason, my husband, sat beside me, jaw clenched as he said that we should call him out, that we shouldn't let him get away with rewriting history to make himself look good. I turned to Emily and asked if she wanted to respond, and she didn't hesitate. Under Michael's post, she wrote a single, brutally honest comment. We didn't stop talking to you because of Mom. We stopped because you make plans and never show up. Because you don't call on our birthdays. Because you care more about looking like a grandfather than actually being one. If you miss us, prove it. But stop lying about us. Within an hour, her comment had over 50 likes. And then, just as quickly as it had gained traction, it disappeared. Michael had deleted it. Minutes later, Emily received a private message from him, accusing her of being disrespectful, telling her she was too young to understand, insisting that he had done everything he could. She responded calmly, telling him that he hadn't done anything at all, and instead of replying, he blocked her. His own granddaughter. That set Josh off. My 13-year-old son, who had been watching everything unfold, muttered that he was done with this nonsense, and he posted his own comment under Michael's post, writing, "It's funny how Grandpa never remembers our birthdays but somehow always remembers how to play the victim." His comment was deleted within minutes. Then he was blocked too. Noah, my 10-year-old, didn't post anything. He just looked at me with a sad, knowing expression and said, "Grandpa doesn't love us. He just wants people to think he does." 2 days later, Michael texted me, claiming that he wanted to make amends, that he wanted to take the kids out to dinner, as if a fancy meal could erase years of neglect. I was skeptical, but my children agreed on one condition. They would go, but they wouldn't pretend everything was fine. If he asked why they didn't want a relationship with him, they would tell him the truth. Michael made a big show of choosing the most expensive restaurant in town, a place so over the top that it was almost laughable. When we arrived, we saw that he wasn't alone. Lori was there, along with 2 of her well-dressed friends, all sipping wine as if they were at a high society event. The moment we sat down, Michael threw on the performance of his life, exclaiming how wonderful it was to see his grandchildren, how much he had missed them, how important family was. Emily simply raised an eyebrow and asked whose fault it was that they hadn't seen each other in so long. He ignored the question, and the night quickly revealed itself for what it was, a charade. He spent the entire evening talking about himself, about his travels, his health, his career, without asking a single question about Emily's studies, Josh's soccer games, or Noah's drawings. Then, as the waiter cleared the plates, Michael pulled out his phone, announcing that they should take a picture together so he could share it online. That was when Emily had enough. No, she said flatly, and when Michael blinked in confusion, she repeated herself. No, we're not close. You don't know us. You ignore us unless there's an audience. We're done pretending. Lori gasped, scandalized, and scolded her for being rude, but Josh backed his sister up immediately, pointing out that what was actually rude was dragging them here just for a Facebook post. Michael's face darkened as he insisted that he was trying, that he had always tried. But Noah, in the way only a child could, delivered the final blow by quietly asking, "Then why do you only care about us when other people are watching?" Michael turned red. Lori looked mortified. Her friends avoided eye contact, clearly regretting being there to witness his humiliation. And then, just as always, when faced with his own failings, Michael got angry. He turned to Emily and accused her of being brainwashed by me, claiming that I had poisoned my children against him. Emily just laughed, shaking her head as she told him that he had done that all on his own. A week later, Lori called me, saying that they were organizing a family meeting, claiming that Michael wanted to fix things. I had no intention of going, but my children insisted on one last chance. When we arrived, I realized immediately that it wasn't a meeting, it was an ambush. The room was filled with extended family, people Michael had clearly gathered as an audience for whatever spectacle he had planned. He stood in the center of the room and solemnly declared that the family had been broken for too long, that it was time to repair it. Emily, unimpressed, asked exactly how he planned to do that, and Michael, ever the actor, said that the answer was forgiveness, that we all needed to let go of the past. Josh scoffed, calling it convenient that he suddenly wanted to move on now that people were watching. Aunt Linda tried to step in, insisting that Michael was making an effort, but Emily cut her off, saying that he wasn't trying at all, he was pretending. She pointed out that he had blocked them for telling the truth, that he had ignored them for years and only cared when he was being called out. Michael's face twisted in fury, and he snapped that he had done nothing but try, calling them ungrateful brats, but Noah simply looked at him and said, "If you really wanted to reconnect, Grandpa, you would have tried before we had to embarrass you." Lori, her face burning with humiliation, stood up and told us to leave. Emily smiled and agreed. We walked out, and Michael never tried again. But, of course, he kept posting as if we had. For years, Michael had lurked on the edges of my life, never fully present but always lingering just enough to remind me that he could still try to manipulate me when it suited him. Every interaction, every attempt at reconciliation, had been a carefully staged performance, one designed not to heal old wounds, but to protect his image. He didn't care about my children, not in any meaningful way. He cared about what having grandchildren made him look like. When my kids finally saw through his act and called him out, he reacted the only way he knew how, with anger, blame, and self-pity. And for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely done. I blocked him. I blocked Lori too, just to make sure she couldn't slither her way back into my inbox with more guilt-tripping nonsense. The moment I did it, a strange feeling washed over me, relief. A pressure I hadn't even realized I was carrying disappeared. For years, even when I had kept my distance, there had always been that small, lingering thought in the back of my mind. What if he changes? What if he finally acts like a father? What if one day he actually wants to make things right? But I finally saw it for what it was, a lie I had been telling myself, one that had kept me tethered to a man who had never truly cared about me. And once I accepted that, I felt free. At first, I expected him to try something dramatic. Some desperate attempt to force his way back in, maybe through extended family or some kind of public spectacle. But instead, something much more interesting happened. His world began to fall apart. For years, Lori had been his biggest defender, the one who had encouraged him to push me aside, the one who had gleefully erased me from his life so that she could have him all to herself. But Michael had always been a selfish man, and the way he had treated me wasn't exclusive to me alone. Lori's own children, my step-siblings in the loosest sense of the word, had never particularly liked me growing up. They had taken after their mother, seeing me as an outsider, someone who didn't fit into their perfect little world. But they had never experienced Michael the way I had. Michael had spent years lurking on the edges of my life, never fully present but always inserting himself just enough to remind me that, when it suited him, he could still try to manipulate me. Every interaction we had, every forced attempt at reconciliation, had been nothing more than a carefully staged performance designed not to heal old wounds but to protect his own image. He never truly cared about my children in any meaningful way. He only cared about what having grandchildren made him look like. And when my kids finally saw through the act and called him out for exactly what he was, he reacted the only way he knew how, with anger, blame, and self-pity. That was when I knew, without any doubt, that I was truly, completely done. I blocked him. I blocked Lori too, just to make sure she couldn't find some way to slither her way back into my inbox with more guilt-tripping nonsense. And the moment I did it, a strange and unfamiliar feeling washed over me, a relief so overwhelming that it nearly brought me to tears. There had always been a lingering thought in the back of my mind, no matter how much I tried to ignore it, whispering that maybe one day he would change, that maybe, at some point, he would finally act like a father, that maybe, if I waited long enough, he would actually try to make things right. But the moment I hit that block button, I realized I had been lying to myself for years, clinging to a delusion that had only kept me tethered to a man who had never once treated me like I mattered, and when I finally let go of that last, fragile hope, I felt lighter than I ever had in my entire life. At first, I expected him to react, to make some dramatic, desperate attempt to force his way back in, maybe by rallying extended family or creating some kind of public spectacle, but instead, something far more interesting happened. His entire world began to fall apart. For years, Lori had been his biggest defender, the one who had encouraged him to push me aside, the one who had gleefully erased me from his life so that she could have him all to herself. But Michael had always been a selfish man, and the way he had treated me wasn't exclusive to me alone. Lori's own children, who had once been just as dismissive of me as she was, had never experienced the real Michael, the version of him that I had known my entire life, because they had never been on the receiving end of his cruelty. Until now. Lori had 2 children from her previous marriage, Brad and Vanessa, who were both in their 40s with families of their own, and for years, they had been completely taken in by the same carefully curated image of Michael that he had spent a lifetime maintaining. To them, he had always been the charming, respectable stepfather who was generous with gifts, who showed up for the big, public moments, who played the role of the doting family man when it was convenient. But as he got older and sicker and needed more attention, more care, more effort, Lori, who had spent years prioritizing Michael above all else, expected her own children to take on the burden of dealing with him. And that was when things began to unravel. Brad refused outright, saying that he had his own family, his own responsibilities, and that he wasn't going to rearrange his life to cater to Michael's every whim. And while Vanessa initially tried to step in, she quickly realized what I had always known, that nothing would ever be enough for Michael, that the moment he felt he wasn't getting the exact amount of attention he believed he deserved, he would lash out, guilt trip, and blame her for failing him. He had spent years believing that Lori's children would always be loyal to him, that no matter what, they would continue to play along with his charade, but the moment they started pulling away, the moment they stopped bending over backward to please him, he turned on them just as quickly as he had turned on me, and Lori, for the first time, found herself on the receiving end of the same cruel indifference she had once encouraged him to show me. Desperate to salvage the situation, Lori did what she had always done when things started falling apart. She planned a family appreciation dinner, a grand public event designed to convince everyone that nothing was wrong, that Michael was still the beloved patriarch, that their family was just as strong and close as ever. She invited everyone, extended relatives, old friends, even distant acquaintances who hadn't been in the picture for years, all in an attempt to fill the room with enough people to make it seem like Michael was still surrounded by love and respect. But when the night arrived, almost no one showed up. Brad and Vanessa weren't there. Their kids weren't there. Even Lori's own sister, who had once been one of her closest confidants, had suddenly developed other plans. The people who did attend weren't there out of love. They were there out of obligation, curiosity, or, in some cases, sheer pity. A handful of Michael's old business acquaintances sat stiffly in their seats, sipping wine and making strained small talk about the stock market. A couple of Lori's friends clinked their glasses and spoke loudly about how wonderful it is to have a close-knit family, while very pointedly avoiding the empty chairs around them. The energy was awkward, stilted, lifeless. But the most glaring absence, the one that Michael had been relying on, was the absence of my children. He had expected, assumed, that they would be there, that they would sit by his side and smile for the cameras, that they would embrace him and tell him they had forgiven him. But they weren't there. They were at home, watching a movie, completely uninterested in whatever sad little performance he was trying to put on. Michael, realizing how pathetic the evening was turning out to be, tried one last desperate act to save face. He stood, raised his glass, and began a speech. He spoke about how important family was, about how much effort he had always put into being a good father and grandfather, about how, despite the challenges and misunderstandings, he had never stopped loving his family, and how he would always be there, waiting for the day when we would finally see the truth and come back to him. The moment he finished speaking, Lori started clapping, clearly hoping that everyone would join in, and a few people awkwardly followed suit, but there was no real energy, no genuine warmth, just forced, hollow applause that faded almost as quickly as it had begun. The illusion had shattered, and Michael, standing there in the silence, finally seemed to realize that he had nothing left. The people who had once worshipped him were gone. The children and grandchildren he had ignored were no longer waiting for his attention. The family he had spent years manipulating, neglecting, and using had finally seen him for what he was, a selfish, bitter man who had spent his entire life taking but never giving anything in return. And as I sat at home, sipping tea with my husband, listening to my children laugh in the other room, I felt something I had never felt before. Freedom. Michael was no longer my problem. His approval no longer mattered. His presence, his absence, his existence had no hold over me anymore. He had spent his entire life making sure I knew I wasn't important to him, and now, at last, he wasn't important to me. For the first time, I was truly, completely free.